Hello and welcome to In Conversation. My name is James Campbell and today I'm joined by Erin Manning, a cultural theorist, philosopher and artist. We'll be talking about her new book, Being in Relation, which explores how we come to know, create and care with one another rather than as isolated individuals. We'll get into relation, neurodiversity, pedagogy and the role of art in thinking and living together. Hello, Erin. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to have you on the podcast. How's it going?
Good. Great to be here.
Brilliant. Well, maybe to start with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? You know, do you teach? What roles you have, and what are your main research interests?
I do. I teach at Concordia University in Montreal, and I also co-direct the Three Ecologies project with Brian Masumi, which is located 3 hours north of Montreal, and it is a para-academic environment that's also committed to challenging the foregrounding of private property. So a big aspect of our lives is taking land out of the property market and in the way that we put it, to give it back to itself. So I have a life that is in the university, and also a big part of my life is thinking about other ways of living. And in between all of that, I somehow work between, writing and art making and gardening and, spending a lot of time cutting wood for firewood since the site up north is completely off-grid.
Wow, okay. Do you find that your physical space and those kinds of activities kind of affect your thinking and your day-to-day kind of practice?
Yeah, I've always begun with movement. All of my thinking begins there. The biggest difference, I think, with the Three Ecologies project is that the movement is very specific to the functioning of the environment. So I'm not going to a studio to dance, or I'm not going often enough either to the studio to make art. I'm really on the land, learning how to engage all the systems that need to be engaged in order to make a large off-grid environment work, and partly because it's a site where we welcome anyone who needs or wants to be engaged. So we have a cabin that's always free and open, and it's an environment that facilitates modes of encounter that Brian and I also want to support. So yes, I've always felt that philosophical work occurs in the encounters with the world, and really is, it deeply benefits from those encounters.
Well, thank you very much for giving us a bit of background and also some insight into that, which sounds like a wonderful way of being and living. So is this something that people could find out more about online? Is it a project that people can...
Yeah, so Brian and I and the wider network around the Three Ecologies, we tend to be very bad at self-promotion.
Yeah.
So, and we, it's come out of decades long work that was called SenseLab. But if you go to threeecologies.org, you will find out about that work. And it is really a word of mouth environment. People are always welcome to contact me, and I can lead them further. We have continuous reading groups and different kinds of explorations, conceptual, philosophical. Right now, we're working really hard to really think about what it means to give land back to itself philosophically. We figured out how to do it legally, but there are differences between giving land back to itself and the land back movement, and trying to think about that. And also in the context of the very specific area which we're in, which is the sort of the south of the north in Quebec, and also thinking with the unceded territories of different Indigenous nations, and collaborating also with hereditary chiefs in the area. So there's a lot going on there, and people are always welcome to come and participate in either online or in person.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that. That sounds really fascinating. And living in Tucson, Arizona myself, this notion of working with the desert, is really very much in the culture here. And of course, we're on Tohono O'odham land, and the tribe is really generous with their knowledge sharing. And it's just been really fascinating for me to be involved in some of these similar projects. That sounds like it to what you've been doing up there in the north. So that's really good to hear. I wanted to jump into being in relation though. So I just wanted to start with, because it's people who haven't read the book, it's got some complicated ideas in there, to say the least. Wonderful book that it is. But I was wondering if you could maybe just give our listeners, what's it all about in a nutshell?
Yeah, it's a tough question, isn't it?
I thought that might be
well, I think that there's a concept that's at the heart of the book that comes from Caribbean philosopher and poet Edouard Glissant, and that has been taken up by Brazilian philosopher Denise Ferreira da Silva. And the concept is difference without separability. Difference without separability. I think that's what the book is about. So difference without separability is it is what it sounds like, the hardest thing in the world, right? Because what we've mostly been trained toward is difference with separation, right? So if you're different from me, we claim our differences from each other, but we also foreground a discourse of commonality. So these two things happen conjointly. We want to claim our difference from, our separation from, at the same time as we want to idealize our commonality with. Difference without separability refuses both of those ways. It says that what brings us together is our difference. And papering that difference over is actually the most violent thing you can do.
Right.
But to grow in the difference without separability is to have to develop techniques for the encounter that will not result in a kind of pre-packaged commonality. It won't resolve itself into I know who you are, right? What it does instead is say, who am I in this new encounter? Who are you in this new encounter? And what kinds of worlds can be crafted there?
Well, I think that's a really you've done a really good job there of actually trying to encapsulate what the book's about. I think that's pretty much on the money from my point of view. And I do want to get into a bit more detail about the Glissant's ideas and how you combine them with others. But before I ask those questions, I was just wondering, and again, based on what you've just said, what's the kind of aim of the work? What would you like the impact of this project to be? Did you set out with a specific goal, and who's the sort of audience that you expect to read this and gain the most from it?
So I'm a painter. I haven't painted for a while, but I spent decades painting. And one of the things I noticed as a painter was that when you finish a painting, or at least when I finished a painting and there was still some paint on my easel or however I had mixed the paint, that another painting would emerge, and it was like the leftover painting, and often that leftover painting allowed me to see a path that I couldn't see before. I'm not saying that it was always good, but it was always interesting. It always opened up a door. Being of Relation is a bit of the leftover book for Pragmatics of the Useless. So I wrote a big book for Pragmatics of the Useless that I published during the pandemic at Duke University Press. And it's probably worth saying a few words about For Pragmatics of the Useless to understand what Being of Relation is trying to do. And in order to do that, I have to go back to the book before. So the book before For Pragmatics of the Useless was called The Minor Gesture. In The Minor Gesture, I was working hard to think through a logic that establishes itself through the minor. And the minor isn't less. A lot of people want to think the minor is less. It's not less than the major. It just moves differently from the major. So an image I often give people when I think about the minor is a leak in a roof. You have a leak in a roof. The leak is going to destroy your whole house if you're not careful. But it's minor in the sense that it comes perhaps from one site and begins to grow an environment of mold or an environment of wetness across a larger structure. So the minor has a quality of movement. And in that sense, it's harder to capture, which makes that leak in the ceiling a real frustration, because you can't just locate it and solve it through that, in that way. So so a minor modality isn't good or bad. It's simply has a different tenor. When I wrote the minor gesture, I was also thinking a lot with Fred Moten's work. Fred Moten is an African-American poet and philosopher whose work is just scintillating, and I'm not the only person who thinks so. And so it was, Fred was one of the people I asked to be a reader when it went out for readers' reports. In the book, I had a paragraph where I had done this thing that is quite typical. I don't do it anymore, but I think of it now as a sort of white thing, a sort of scared white person thing, which is that you write a paragraph where you kind of try to address all the people who could think you might not be thinking with them, So like I have that sentence, like the disabled and the racialized and the neurodiverse and that. And in that paragraph, I had said that I thought neurodiversity or neurotypicality was a kind of first identity politics before even you get to a question of racial considerations.
Okay.
And Fred wrote this most beautiful report. And in the report, he said that that was something that he disagreed with, that statement. And he said, because he said, Black life is always neurodiverse life.
Right.
So the minor gesture was about to come out, and I thought, shit, how do I address this? So there's this footnote in the minor gesture that says, I've got something to think about, but I can't do it here, right? Yeah. And that thought became For Pragmatics of the Useless, where I tried to develop another kind of logic that I called the logic of approximation of proximity. So I was trying to think what happens when we have a logic that really, really is not about the common, but it is a logic that sidles. So when you say Black life is neurodiverse life, you're not saying all Black people are autistic. You're not saying all those things that on the surface it could sound like. What you're saying is neurotypicality is a systemic operation that is refused to or refuses Blackness. And so I wrote that book, and it's a big book. It's a 350-page book. And I think The Being of Relation is like that little painting. Yeah. I had all of those thoughts, and then suddenly they started erupting in smaller gestures. So The Being of Relation has these tiny, tiny little parts, for example, like these mini chapters that are 1 pages or 3 pages. These are all coming as a kind of thoughts in germ that can only emerge once you've thought through a logic. So it's a book that sort of continues that logic of difference without separability, but through perhaps more pointed windows in that I couldn't get to in For Pragmatics, because it was a more it was a bigger, sort of heavier monument.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for anyone who hasn't encountered the book, it's relatively short, and the format is almost like a pocket guide. You can almost say a lengthy manifesto in a sense, and it is obviously theoretical, but it's also tempered with practicality. And I can see exactly that, actually, how it's kind of it definitely is a follow-on, isn't it? You can definitely tell that it connects with your existing work and that you're following things through. So that's really interesting to get your take on that. I love the painting analogy as well. It's a question I've always wanted to ask artists is, how do you know when a painting is finished? And I guess the answer is never, really, depending on who you are. I certainly feel like that when I'm editing photos. Well, we've mentioned that the book's quite theoretical, and that's for sure. But I wanted to delve a little bit deeper into some of that, because you bring together, and again, you have to excuse my pronunciation here, but you bring together Glissant's idea of relation, and then Deligny's work with autistic children, and this notion of errant lines. So what drew you to place those two figures in kind of a conversation, and what kind of came from that pairing? Because for me, that's really interesting. And again, I wasn't familiar with either of them before encountering the book. So it was really eye-opening for me. But yeah, can you just explain a little bit more to our audience what that kind of opened for you?
So let me begin with Edouard Glissant. I've been reading Glissant since I was, I think, 17, and I'm 56. So it's been a long time of reading Glissant. And I'm 100% positive I didn't understand what he was up to when I was 17. It's not that I got what Glissant was doing. In fact, I really think I didn't get what he was doing, but there was a way in which Glissant allowed the world to open itself to me in a way that has been really, really important throughout my thinking. And his work, in the way that complex thinkers' work has unfolded again and again and again as I've become more capable of reading it. And in the early years, what drew me into Glissant's work, was my knowledge of Deleuze and Guattari's work, who were always in conversation with Glissant. I mean, Glissant's a really interesting figure in that regard, that he has these ongoing conversations around process philosophy, as well as these really important conversations around Blackness and race and the Middle Passage. I think it took me a long time to really understand, or to begin to understand, what he was doing with Blackness. So that's Glissant on the one end. Deligny, on the other hand, is a figure that Anglophones don't know well. I encountered Deligny a long time ago as well. French is my mother tongue, so Deligny's thinking would be much more available to me, since most of it hasn't been translated. But Deligny came to me with some frustrations. So I'll give a little bit of background on Deligny for the Anglophone world. Deligny was an educator who did really important work in the 40s and 50s with the people who would be called delinquents. So people who would be in and out of juvenile detention. And in the banlieue, in what is badly, it's not exactly the suburbs, but in the outskirts of Paris and other towns. And I think there's no question that Deligny himself was autistic. It doesn't come up for him. It comes up once in the writing around him. It doesn't really matter. But in the 1960s, he became connected to Félix Guattari and Jean-Henri at Laborde. And Laborde it still exists, but less experimental today, but a really important experiment around mental health, mental illness, psychosis, schizophrenia. At that time, autism was almost always called schizophrenia. So there's no way for us to really know at that time what kind of presence autism took at Laborde, but I suspect it had quite a presence. And I write, so the book, it outlines this history, but I'm saying all of this because Deligny went on to do 30 years of work around autism that the Anglophone world doesn't know. And when he died in the early 2000s, I can't remember the year of his death, all of his writing was put together. I approached the people who own the copyright around Deligny's work maybe around 2009. And I offered to do some translation of his work, and said that I wanted to have some autistics write the preface. And the owner of the rights was just horrifically ableist in her response. She denied that autistics can speak or write, and said that she would be happy for me to do a translation, but she wanted Agamben or Rancière to do the introduction.
Right.
So the being of relation is, in a way, that translation. And so I'm not at all foregrounding it as a translation of the 1,500 pages of Deligny's work. But what I've done, the Being of Relation came about because I went into that book, the 1,500 pages, and translated the parts that I thought would give an Anglophone reader the most intuitive trajectory through Deligny's thinking. So the Being of Relation opens on this translation, where I then, because Glissant is so much in my body, I find myself reading it with Glissant. Like, it was really an intuitive encounter. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So for people who've never seen the book, it truly is a translation. I mean, it's blocks of texts of translation of Deligny's work, with me entering into those translations in a kind of conversation both about autism and about language, being influenced deeply, deeply by the errant thought of Glissant, and being incapable of not putting that into conversation with the errant lines of Deligny, because how could I not? So do you see what I'm saying? It's Erin, really. There isn't like a really sort of smart answer I can give to why you need to read Glissant with Deligny. I don't think you do, but I did.
Okay, right. Well, then what about anyone out there who's now like, this sounds fascinating. Where should I start? Do you have any recommendations for anybody listening with regard to Glissant's work?
You need to read Poetics of Relation, and you need to be aware, as I hope my book will show you, that the English translation has real problems. So there are two parts of the Being of Relation where I go into great detail from a translator's perspective on the problems of the English translation. And I'll just say one thing that struck me, even though I'd been reading Glissant for decades, because I'd been reading him in French, I didn't know this until I was doing this book. And so as a reader of the Being of Relation will see, the problem with the translation of Deligny is similar. I mean, it's similar in the sense that it's an untranslatable book. It's untranslatable because Deligny is inventing languages. And he's really creating what Adam Wolfond, who's autistic poet, talks about as languaging. But in the case of Glissant, what is really important is this. Now I sound a bit professorial, but I really think it's urgent.
Well, you are.
Well, I guess, yeah. So Glissant's work is incredibly generous to white-skinned people. In my own work, I differentiate between whiteness and white-skinned people. Whiteness is a systemic operation that white-skinned people have access to and are given privilege through.
Right.
But being white-skinned is not the same as whiteness. And my work has been really engaged in this. And I want to be really emphatic about this, because whiteness is much, much more dangerous than the limitation of, assigning it to white skin, which is not to say that white supremacy isn't connected to white skin. I'm not saying that. So you have to think in a logic when you're thinking about this. And Glissant is one of the best teachers for this, in my view. Another great, great teacher for this is Fred Moten. And there are so many others: Sadia Hartman, Tina Capt, Rosanna Bradley. I could name and name and name. It's not that there are just the two of them, but Glissant is really my teacher. And Glissant does this by refusing to foreground a simple dichotomy or a simple binary between transparency and opacity, where transparency would be white and opacity would be black. This is not a binary that he accepts, and his whole work is about that. But at the beginning of A Poetics of Relation, there's a 3-paragraph moment where he talks about the middle passage. In a book that is really generous toward white-skinned people, if they can connect to opacity, right? Which is really generous in the sense that it says there is a way to be white-skinned without giving into whiteness.
Okay.
In that book, he has 3 paragraphs that are not, in my reading of it, that are not written for white people. And in those 3 paragraphs, he changes the mode of address to the popular mode of address in French, the figure of tu. So in French literature, you would never write in that popular mode, in that mode of intimacy, right? You would write in the third person, in the second person plural, vous. Right? In the English, we don't have that separation. It's you in both. But in French, you have tu, which is like to a parent or to a child or to a close friend or to a lover. And then you have vous, which is the more formal. For 3 paragraphs, he writes in the form of tu.
Ah, interesting.
And that is the moment in my reading of it of speaking to Blackness itself and Black-skinned people.
You've also like said a few things today that have made me really think about how many philosophers and critical theorists and theorists I've read in English who are writing in French, whether they be the canonized, those we expect, or from former colonies and places like that, that I'm wondering how much I've missed by reading the translation or a specific translation. And I know it's an obvious thing to say, but I think it's something you kind of forget sometimes when you're reading a grand philosopher or even interesting cutting edge stuff from someone. You maybe aren't actually considering the translation as much as the or thinking about it in those terms. So you've made me think a little bit today about that.
Well, you know, I think that that's also not the end of the world. Okay. So I live with a translator. My partner, Brian Masumi, is a great translator of Deleuze and Guattari and other thinkers. And I'm not a good translator myself, as is quite typical of people who learn 2 languages at once. We go so easily between language that we're not so precise about the equivalencies in language. But I live in a world where we're working across language all the time. There's no classroom where I'm not working across French and English all the time, and I speak other languages as well. But I'm not somebody who oversees the translations of my own work, even in French. My partner does. Brian oversees his translations with great care. I don't. And you know, the reason is because I think these conversations are so interesting.
Right.
So like the fact that it was not translated in the English with that, you know, that the translator papered over it, it allowed me to also write the being of relation, right? And I think that the approximations that we live with are important, even when they are like, that's also difference without separability. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's even, I could tell you, you know, now you know that it's tu in French doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily become a generous reader. Right? So I think that the most important thing is that we be in conversation and that we be perhaps less. There's a tendency in academia to be really paranoid. Mm. And the citational operations can make us very paranoid that we're going to say it wrong and get it wrong and do it wrong or not be smart enough or not, you know, and I think actually that's holding us back from being in conversation. Like, what if the fact that I get it wrong means we can talk? And what if it means that you can write a book?
Do you think that's a bit more of an obsession of folks who are working in, say, the arts and humanities more than, say, STEM science subjects, where I feel like a lot of scientists, it's all about building on the shoulders of others, you know, their failings lead to your observations, your failings lead to the next, and then we progress and we move forward. Whereas maybe in the arts and humanities, people are a bit more obsessed, like you say, with how they're being perceived, citation, making sure that they're following the right protocols. Do you think that's a bit of a distraction?
I've never thought of it that way, but that makes a lot of sense to me. And it makes me think about two things. I mean, one of the things, since this is a podcast, is just in case you haven't Googled yet, I am white. And I write about Blackness, right? And so of course you can imagine how scary that is. Yeah, of course it's scary. I also write about deaf blindness, and I'm not deaf blind, and I also have written for decades now about autism, and I'm not autistic.
Mhm.
Um, and we do live in a world right now in this particular period where there's a lot of anxiety about
Mhm.
whether or not we can speak about experiences that we don't have directly. And I try to address that question in the work that I do. At the same time, to come back to difference without separability. This morning I was having a conversation with my friend John Lee Clark, who's deafblind. And so when John and I speak, he speaks ProTactile, and I'm not fluent in ProTactile, so we have an interpreter. And I would say a third of the conversation is John talking to the interpreter about not getting something across the way that he's wanting to get it across. So we're having a conversation about translation at the same time as we're having a conversation. And the fact is that I've never been deafblind. I will never be deafblind, probably. And John has never been seeing, hearing. But to reduce our experience to a belief that all deafblind people could be in agreement about every sentence would be ridiculous, right? We're having a three-way conversation that carries the three-wayness of that conversation in ways that are making us laugh, and that are making us confused, and that are making us excited, and so on and so forth. And as long as the three of us can retain the modesty of our difference, I think we're going to have an interesting conversation. So I think what you're saying about STEM or the sciences is really interesting. I think that in the fear of getting it wrong, we curtail the kinds of conversations we could have. And I'm not saying for a second that there aren't violent ways to disregard difference. Obviously, that's not what I'm interested in. But to practice difference without separability, I think it is necessary to not begin with the presupposition that we're in full control of a pre-existing identity.
Well, maybe just to linger on identity there as well, because you make a strong point that whiteness and neurotypicality are not just identities, and that they are systems, and that you've kind of referred to that already, and that these systems organize how we relate together. So how do you see those systems shaping everyday life in places like schools, like universities, public space, where people are interacting?
Yeah. So it took me a while to get here, right? I wrote several books around autistic perception and neurodiversity before I understood the neurotypical as systemic. And I think that tends to be my way, that it takes me time to get into a place where I can really begin to understand what's happening. Um, and the reason, or one of the reasons it took time, is that when I started writing about neurodiversity, the world looked and felt different to what it looks and feels like now with respect to neurodiversity. I mean, we're talking a period of time in, the 2007, 8, 9, 10, where facilitated communication was becoming more well known, but more so in autistic environments, or in some other kind of environments with what one might call motor disturbance, like cerebral palsy or stroke, or environments like that. And the writings around neurodiversity were mostly blogs, and often written by quite young people who are 12, 13, 14, 15. These were the people I was reading. And I was coming to their thinking from the perspective of trying to think about movement. So in my earliest work, I don't even name neurodiversity or autism. I'm engaging Mel Baggs without ever saying they're autistic, because I wasn't thinking about that then. And as those folks started to be in touch with me, And we became collaborators and friends, and I started teaching philosophy to them at night and got to know more and more folks who were quote unquote non-speaking. It's a terrible way to put it, but people who don't speak with their voice. And then, slowly began publishing their work and so on. In that period that took maybe 15 years, neurodiversity was becoming more well known, and the discourse of what people call neurodivergence was becoming well known. I've never liked the term neurodivergence. To my mind, it cements a kind of binary and allows the typicality to be the baseline. Because if you're neurodivergent, there's an idea that there's a baseline that you depart from. And it was when I started to have to come to face with my discomfort with the term neurodivergence that I began to realize that there was no person who was neurotypical. And in order to begin to then go into that thinking without falling into a relativism, I needed to really then think about the systemic. And of course, the place where that had most been thought was around whiteness. Right. So I needed Black scholars. Mostly they were Black scholars. I mean, some white folks too, of course, but the discourse of Blackness as para-ontological. And so the notion that existing ontologies can't hold on to Blackness because Blackness is excluded from the dominant ontologies is what allowed me then to think about neurotypicality in that way. And the more I thought about neurotypicality that way, the more I understood Fred Moten's sentence that Black life has always been neurodiverse life, right? And so this has been sort of an ongoing way to then begin to be able to pinpoint the framings of neurotypicality on our existence. So, for example, sit up straight. That's probably the first way, right? Eat with your knife and fork. Now, I've never been comfortable eating with a knife and fork.
Right.
Now I know why, but it took me, so it wasn't until 2019 or so that folks I'd been collaborating with said to me, Erin, why don't you ever talk about your own neurodiversity?
Right.
To be honest, James, I had never thought about it.
Yeah,
Because I don't tend to think in identitarian terms.
Yeah.
But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, oh my goodness, that's why classrooms were so painful for me. That's why statements like stop moving were so painful for me. Or social environments have been so painful for me. And so the more I thought about that, the more I realized, wow, Erin, you've really been claimed by neurotypicality, right? So you have a body, unlike these classical autistics who can't be claimed because their bodies defy the claim. They fall out of it. Okay. I have a body that can be tamed by neurotypicality. And that has something to do with how I can excel in certain value systems that neurotypicality prizes. I speak well. I can function in an environment that requires of me that I pay attention in a certain way. I can give eye contact, right? But the question is at what cost?
Right.
And so I've now, over years and years of thinking about it, have transformed, for example, the classroom into a neurodiverse classroom. I don't make any of those requirements. You don't have to be in the space. You can walk out. You can take your phone with you and take the class with you. You can sit on the floor. You can fall asleep. You can learn in a way that I can't fathom, and I'll believe you that you're learning. But it's taken me a long time to begin to understand the hold that neurotypicality has on us. And then, of course, to follow on from that, once you begin to realize the hold neurotypicality has, then I think as a white-skinned person, you begin to really get a feeling for the violence of systemic racism.
It's a really interesting connection, that is. And this notion about awakening to the effects of neurotypicality and just what's considered normal, as it were, That's really fascinating, because that's something that I've been awakened in me in recent years, really this year, and really more conscious of the way that things have affected me personally throughout life, and I'm more aware of certain things, and didn't have the language necessarily, or the references to be able to comprehend it in these terms. With that in mind, do you think that younger generations who have more faculties to comprehend this stuff in common parlance day to day, just because of where we are as a culture and society now, do you find that they'll be able to engage with your work, find it more straightforward? Do you find that there's a generational shift there potentially?
Absolutely. I think, I mean, what a relief, you know, to realize that, I mean, it's kind of terrible, isn't it, that I wrote all these books and still didn't have the generosity toward myself even to say, you know, Erin, the reason why this hurts so much is because neurotypicality is that painful. You know, you didn't need to be good at that. I mean, we started our conversation about self-promotion. I can't do it. I can't do it. It's not just that I don't want to do it. I can have intense conversations. I can be social in a way when it feels like it matters, but I can't do it if you're asking me to separate myself out from the world and somehow make a case. I'm being kissed by my cat right now.
I was going to say, I know you've got new additions to the family here.
So what I would say is about the younger generation is that, I mean, I think it's true to say that the kids are not all right. They're really, really not all right. I teach them. We live in a violent world where the conditions for existence are jagged, and the pain is unbearable. And people in my generation, I feel very strongly that we need to stop saying things like, well, it's up to them. It's not up to them. It's up to us. We need to do the work. We have work to do. We who have jobs and you know, the financial wherewithal to make it possible for them to build a world, we need to be on it. And as part of that, I think I see it as my work to try my best in the most gentle way possible to get them out of the pathology paradigm. So one of the things that's happened, which with the focus on neurodivergence, is that the pathological has entered the scene in a way that terrifies me. So while it's really, really great to realize that neurotypicality has been a violent presence in the life of someone who's neurodiverse, it's often happened in a way that people are now counting off their pathologies. Hi, I'm ADHD because X, Y, Z, I'm autistic. I've never done that, and I'm not going to do it today. I'm not going to tell you my pathologies. It's not that interesting. I did mention early on that I wasn't autistic, and the reason I do that is because I've written a lot about autism, and I think it's important to say that because of where my work is. But the autistics I work with have, there's no moment in their lives where they get to be not autistic, right? I mean, nobody in the world that they encounter thinks they're smart because they can't speak. So being autistic is not this path to easy living. It's also this most extraordinary thing that is them, you know, that allows them to be the sensitive, extraordinarily exciting, exorbitant, you know, just sensual people that they are, you know. So when I'm with young people, my work could be threatening too to them because it doesn't take the pathological stream, because I'm wanting to challenge the binary of the neurotypical and the neurodivergent. And I'm wanting them to perhaps trust that there is a world that we can make that doesn't have to be cemented by a frame that we call identity. That said, I have been so moved by the young people in my classes these past couple of years. And I find them to be complex, thoughtful, you know, around also issues of sexuality and gender in ways that are simply, that older generations have so much to learn from. So I don't want to, like,
Can't
it's
comprehend.
amazing,
Yeah,
right?
they're
So,
such gatekeepers as well as a result.
so what I say to them is when we use identity structures, we just have to realize that we're being defensive.
Yeah.
And that we live in a world where we're constantly having to be defensive. Like, there's really good reasons why we're being defensive.
Very,
And
very
so,
common.
we just need to work, all of us, but perhaps people who are in older generations, to create conditions for a less defensive world.
Wow, yeah. It's just something, just thinking about, relationships I have with people in my own life, whether it be through work, family, all different things. That level of defensiveness with people of certain generation or several generations, and people within my own and younger too. But definitely there's an age thing there where they don't necessarily have the experience or the faculties of talking about or experiencing these things through those lenses. So as a result, the modus operandi is like defense. That's not something that we ever had. That's definitely something for your generation. Whatever's gone wrong with you lot, kind of approach. And it's so obviously defensive. It's sort of, if you're like, oh, well, have you ever thought about talking to a therapist or to a friend about any of these things? Well, I don't have those thoughts or feelings. I think that's obviously something that you younger people have to deal with, and that's obviously for some reasons I don't know, but we're fine. Don't talk to me about that stuff. Get out now.
Exactly.
I know I'm speaking. So I'm 42, and I know you said that you're in your sort of 50s. So we're both getting up there. So it's not like we're both young, youngins or anything, but yeah, definitely with people of our age groups, but then also a bit older and stuff. It's that notion of defensive-ness. And I think you've really kind of encapsulated that in quite a powerful and simplistic way, which I think is quite meaningful. But I guess we just wish we could maybe bridge across that gap a bit more sometimes, especially as a lot of those people are still in power, still
exactly,
directing the narrative, and are gatekeepers to culture and education, society, and all the other things.
Exactly, and I think that's why in Being of Relation, I end the book on the question of the pedagogical,
right?
For that reason, that one of the things that worries me a lot, and here I'm speaking from an academic standpoint, but I don't just mean university, really. I mean the way in which we're framed into being people of knowledge, the way whiteness does that. The concern I have is that there's a tendency for a certain kind of rhetoric of change, which is good. I'm not saying it's bad to have a rhetoric of change. I mean, we're seeing fascism in the United States and the total breakdown of what is thinkable in the education environment. So I'm all for rhetoric if that's all you can get. But if you can get more than rhetoric, which you still can in the context in which I teach, I think it's important. And one of the things that I really am concerned about is that we can talk about methods for decolonization, for example, which is quite common in the environment which I find myself, but with very little discussion about neurotypicality. And very little discussion about the value system that accompanies it. And in the academic system, what that immediately kind of means, what it comes down to, is a discussion of evaluation. So, students go into class after class after class where they're evaluated for being neurotypical. That's what the evaluation does. It asks whether you can perform according to those very mandates.
Yes.
So you can't talk about that as decolonial. There's nothing decolonial in that. Zero. right? And it builds on a narrative of scarcity that neurotypicality depends upon, and that capitalism depends upon, right? So you have to create an environment where you can only allow certain people to hold the knowledge, and then the holding of the knowledge has to be done in a very specific way that the student embodies. So the student becomes the embodiment of the A grade, or the student becomes the embodiment of that spectrum of value, and that becomes the student who can get grants, and it becomes the student who can publish, and it becomes the professor, and so on and so forth. And then if that is called decolonial, what happens is that you have bodies who are, neurodiversity is a kind of clocking mechanism for the discomfort of a kind of thing we call gaslighting, right? So neurodiverse bodies are awake, and they're like, wait, what's happening? And then you're surprised you have a classroom full of anxiety.
Right.
Of course you do, right? So the work that needs to be done there is really pragmatic, and I'm not seeing it happening. I'm seeing all kinds of people reasoning themselves out of allowing it to happen.
Okay. Yeah, powerful. And I have two follow-up questions that I want to ask you based on what you've said there. You've mentioned this notion of parapedagogies, which is slightly new to me, I must say. So I wanted to ask if you could just explain what that sort of term means, how you use it in the book, and then what that looks like in practice.
Mm-hmm. So some years ago, I started to think about that prefix para, and I was actually thinking about it in terms of para institutions. For example, the Artist Run Center would be a para institution, or the art gallery could be a para institution. I mean, the question of bureaucracy plays into the question. So in my mind, along with my thinking around the minor, to think, well, what kinds of movements are possible in various kinds of institutions, like a dinner party can foster a certain kind of thinking that is different from I don't know, a restaurant, which is different from, and so on. And often what you find is that the more sideways the environment is, the more wiggle room it has. And then the more sure of itself an institution is, the more slow its bureaucracies are, and the less change is possible there. So I find it as as process philosophy, I tend to think is a philosophy that I would call speculatively pragmatic. So you're always asking how things work and how else they work, so you're asking this kind of double question. And so I'm not so interested in being against things. I'm more interested in thinking about what they can do and what they can't do. I think that the academic institution is terrible at many, many, many things, including thinking. But it's good at certain things, like attracting really interesting people, right? So then you think, well, okay, so these really interesting people get attracted, but then the bureaucracy of it makes it really difficult for thinking to happen, right?
Yeah.
So why are we asking it to be good at thinking, right? So like, let's take what it is good at, and then what are the para institutions that can foster other ways, right?
Okay.
So for me, for 20 years, I directed SenseLab, which was a sort of, I can see now, a para-institutional experiment trying to sort of squeeze through or pull out or encounter what could work in an academic institution and work elsewhere. But starting already a long time ago, like maybe around 2010, I started opening my classroom for anybody who was interested. And, that could be at the time it was on Skype. It could be on Skype, or you could be in person. And that's how all those autistics who've now become colleagues and friends, I'd have 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds in a PhD course. These are people who've never been even allowed to be in school at all. And sometimes homeless people would come to my classes. People just came. And over the years, it was there'd be maybe a third of the people would be enrolled, and 2/3 of the people would be others. And I got a lot of pushback for this, but and it's still happening. But what I found really important was that the people who were enrolled, they had to face the fact that the majority of the people in the room were there because they wanted to learn. Right? So like, it's very confronting.
Oh yeah.
You know, like you don't, in my classes, you don't have to do homework or essays or anything. I'll still give you a good grade. But I want you to notice that the people who are working the hardest are not getting a credit for it. Right? And so for me, that's a parapedagogy, that I'm saying to you, I'm refusing to play the game where I'm going to evaluate you. I'm not going to evaluate you. I need to give you a mark because I work in a system that requires it. So I will give you an A. But this A has no meaning in my world.
Wow. Okay.
You know, and so we're going to learn together not only how to refuse scarcity, but the other thing we're going to learn together is that this gift of the A, it's actually not me giving it. You're giving it to the person who never showed up to the class. So you have to learn that even though you do all your work, you're not going to get a better grade than the person who never showed up.
I think you're insulating, not you're waking people up to the realities of the real world there as well. I think, you know, that's fascinating, and I think that is a topic for a follow-up conversation. It'd be wonderful to hear a bit more about those methods and to delve deeper into that. But for now, I have just one more question really about the book, and then I'd like to go into a few quick time questions with you as well. But I wanted to ask you, sort of looking ahead, and you know, we've said that being in relation follows on from a lot of work, and it's in conversation with work that you've already produced at different points in your career. But looking ahead, does the book invite any particular next steps, either for you in research, teaching, or shared practice, or for others in general?
Well, Being of Relation has a sister, and her name is Unsettled. And Unsettled came out at the same time, but with minor compositions. And Unsettled is not a book of philosophy, it's a story. And so it engages many of the same thoughts, but this time as a story around indigeneity and settler colonialism in the context of the Three Ecologies project. This summer, the folks from 3E were engaged with the hereditary chiefs up north on blockades against a really terrible lumber law that didn't come to pass. But we are, as I said before, in a constant ongoing conversation about what it means to give land back to itself. And my artwork has also been engaged with that in the last few years. So the way I work is perhaps a bit odd. I've never written a book on purpose. I know that sounds weird, but I really honestly haven't. I work in the world. I have an enormous garden. We're working, you know, in the forest. We have a maple forest. We make maple syrup. We're tending other people's projects. We're working with on these against these laws. And what happens to me is that the work begins to raise over time. I can never predict when it's going to happen. It raises a question that begins to worry me. And then that question gets worked out. And sometimes it gets worked out in art, and sometimes it gets worked out in writing. And so I think the questions that's getting most worked out for me at the moment is that question of what the itself is in giving land back to itself. But I can't tell you exactly how.
Well, you know what? Well, you've stumped me then, because I've been mulling this notion that you introduced at the start of the podcast, and I wanted to ask you, I was going to say, could you just clarify for me what you mean by giving land back to itself? Because I have a notion of that myself.
Right.
I only have a small garden, relatively speaking, but being here in the desert, moving to the desert, and the scarcity here, and returning what was a dirt patch that had been turned into effectively death, had been poisoned by previous owners and had been left just to be stones and clay and nothing else. So returning the land back to itself, for me, is something I think about, but like in the sense of rejuvenating it and allowing it to thrive naturally in the way that it should, and like putting energy and effort into changing it or providing it to be a space for the desert again. So that's kind of my take on it. So my garden is as wild as we can have it, and we're trying to make it as, you know, as full of native species and, you know, the usual stuff that people are trying to do. But down here in the desert, it's kind of even more poignant and pertinent because of the scarcity of water and resources and things like that. So, and a bit like with your logging issue, we have things like data centers down here, which are also trying to come in and take more water resources and take over more of the desert and reclaim the desert. You know, at a time when we really don't need to be doing that. But there's a big conversation to be had there. But anyway, I'd like, what does your sort of definition, how will your working definition, or what do you see by it?
It's exactly that. And I haven't said this because we haven't had time, but Brian, my partner, is also from Arizona and was his best friend started the first seed bank in Tucson.
Oh, wow,
I do know what you're talking about really, really well. And Brian and his high school friends started the first recycling in Arizona. So I know what you're talking about, and it is exactly, it's that doubleness, isn't it, of encountering the land and wanting to assist in times of climate change, assist it in giving it back the conduits it needs to return to itself, but also watching yourself be changed by the process and aggravated by it because it's so slow and confused by it. And so there's definitely that, which is, so I'm also gardening in a very hard climate. I'm zone 3B. I think you must be zone 11. Are you?
We're right here on the Mexican border, and let's say it's a bit arid down here.
Yeah, so we're in opposite. I have 90 days without frost.
Right.
That sun. It's very, very, but all the water I could ever want. Although Quebec, for the first time ever this year, struggled with water. So there's that, absolutely. Which is really, really important because there's a shepherding aspect to it, which there wouldn't have been 100 years ago. So because of the degraded ecologies, the humans do have a role to play in the ecologies of transformation in terms of learning about indigenous histories of fire, for example, and so on and so forth. Like there's a lot for us to learn, or for you to learn how to plant species that can help the land, the chemicals in the earth become extracted and so on. Like there's knowledge, obviously, and but there's also this second aspect which has to do with abolition, and so we talk about abolition, those of us on the left, but I often think people don't realize, or too many people don't realize, that you cannot think abolition outside of a refusal of private property.
Sorry, how do you abolition in what sense? Sorry.
Well, like abolition as in Black study, as in prison abolition, as in abolition of the police, as in as in transformative justice, as in reparative justice. Abolition has a history of thought in the Black civil rights movement and before as a challenge to private property.
Right.
And so if you can't fight your own tether to private property, which is to say also your tether to inheritance, then I think you can't talk about abolition. Right. So the politics of our times is that we need to shepherd these lands and not own them. And that's the tough part, right? Because a lot of people are willing to help the land as long as it's theirs.
That's especially here in the United States. And I mean, this is no disrespect to our American listeners, but this notion of property and individualism at the center of not only American identity, but also this notion of kind of the frontier and beating the land and claiming nature, ownership over nature as being connected with the sort of the mythology of America and the foundational sort of myths. It's just something I've been grappling with in this context. And again, not that the UK or Europe is in any way like better, but there's a bit more notion around collectivism and socialism, frankly.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
and an understanding of what that term actually means.
Yeah.
And I use
Yeah.
that word today because obviously we just had several elections, here in the United
Right.
States, and obviously Mamdani is one in New York, and of course today he's being labelled a communist and a radical Marxist, which neither things I see any evidence for.
Yeah.
But it's just like this terminology around collectivism, community,
Right.
but ownership. It all comes back to that ownership. And I think what you're saying is really fascinating. And you mentioned Native American or indigenous groups, lots of the stewardship of the land and lots of the techniques that they utilized and have been forgotten or have been erased, from collective history. And again, I know you're heading to the Amazon next year, and I know that in the Amazon now, using like LiDAR and other technologies, they've been able to see that the forest was actually farmed but not owned, and it was some different natural techniques and things that we used. So rather than clear cutting the forest, they were growing things that would survive in specific places, so that you would have these cycles and things like that.
Exactly.
A lot more than what I'm just sharing here. But this stuff's all
Yes.
very, very, very fascinating. So I find that concept around ownership that you've highlighted a really interesting one, and in many ways it really is the challenge of our times, isn't it, to change people's perspective and around value and valuing the natural world. So we are in conversation with the natural world, we're part of it. It sounds so cliche and cheesy and corny in a sense, but like it's until recent years, I think I always felt of it as being like humans are separate, and you could be a good human and therefore you protect nature and work with it, but you're separate. And I think that's part of that process of understanding that our identity is intimately linked with the land and nature and the world that we're part of. And I know it's such an obvious thing to say, but at the same time,
no, but it's so important. And I always think with Tommy Orange, who's Native American, when he says, LA is nature too, right? Like we've got to constantly remember that nature isn't where there are more trees. Nature is the world, right? But we need those trees. We really, really, really need those trees. I mean, they allow the conditions of existence as we've come to expect them to thrive. And so when the hereditary chiefs put their foot down this summer, I mean, for listeners who might not know the difference, the hereditary chiefs are matrilineal. And I suspect it's the same in the US, but I'm not sure. But so you have the band councils. The band councils are government structures that mimic, in many ways, the colonial politics that they come from. Hereditary chiefs are chiefs through matrilineal lines that have been given stewardship of vast tracts of lands that remain unceded from their perspective, but aren't recognized as unceded by the governments. And so this summer in the blockades, there was great tension between the hereditary chiefs and the band chiefs. So we're not going to be able to resolve the problem of private property in false binaries like Indigenous, non-Indigenous. Plenty of Indigenous peoples will benefit from private property because they've grown in it, right? And I'm not, and so there's work to be done in terms of teaching ourselves how the market has organized our thinking in terms of value, as you say. And what that has come to mean to us in terms of security. So when Brian and I and others who are interested in 3E are buying land and giving it back to itself, we're effectively throwing our money in the forest, right? There's no return. And you could say that this is, from a security perspective, a really bad idea, like for retirement, for example. But immediately you can also see that the forest is the retirement, right? So the challenge is to stop, again, just to maybe make a full circle, to say, well, indifference without separability, this is not a moral discourse. We're not saying that you, whoever X you are, need to go and give your money to a forest. No, do what you need to do. In that context, I have an academic position. I'm not dying of hunger.
Right.
Right. So I make artwork that sometimes brings money in. I can use those funds to do this work. In the realm of things, the tiny amount of land that we're taking out of the property market isn't going to make a big difference. What we hope is that the cultural transformation in that environment allows a conversation to happen that allows other sort of larger movements to begin to take hold, like those of the First Nations, the hereditary chiefs, and unceded land. So it is a kind of it is work that has to happen in more than one register at the same time. But in order for that to happen, I think we need to be in a logic that's different than the one that tends to be dominant, which is a logic of mutual exclusion, where where we form those kinds of binaries, or even a logic of scalability, which is a very, very normative logic, which says, if it can't scale, it's not doing anything, which is just not true. If you've ever been in a forest, if you think that a logic is logic of scalability, a million things happen all the time, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, well, I really appreciate that perspective, and it's really interesting to hear you reframe these sort of concepts and these ideas a little bit. We're running out of time, so I'm going to ask you a few fun, quick questions to kind of end things off today. And I wanted to begin by asking, who would you say is your greatest influence, or some of your greatest influences? Because there's clearly been a few just from the work that I'm aware of.
I think the person who most feel that way toward is Felix Guattari.
Okay.
So I'll just say why. Felix Guattari, I never met him. My partner did, but I've never met him. He he was a philosopher. He wrote with Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze. He was a psychoanalyst. He developed schizoanalysis, which I think is one of the most exciting contributions to an encounter with neurodiversity on its own terms. But what I imagine, I fabulate around Felix Guattari was that he was always curious about processes. He connected easily and with verve to things he didn't have control over. He was willing to change and learn. He also struggled a lot, as I do as well, with depression and with the heaviness of this world. For sure, was also neurodiverse, and did work that has mattered so infinitely to me, both as a philosopher and as a practitioner. So I think Felix Guattari is my guy.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go and do a little bit of a deep dive after this. And I think the reason I asked that question is it's always interesting for people, I think, who are listening to you. Who did you listen to, or who inspired you? So thank you for sharing that. And I know that you wear many different hats. And we've just been talking about your steward's hat. But if you weren't in academia, broadly speaking, what do you think you'd be doing?
Well, in this, I've suffered a lot of loss in these past few months, of the death of the person I wrote Unsettled about. So if anybody listening to this goes to read Unsettled, he died. Unfortunately, he was young. He was 54. He was my best friend. And he and I mostly gardened together. Both of us are obsessed. Are obsessed with growing things in a climate that's really difficult to grow. So this year we planted 61 kinds of tomatoes.
Wow.
And you have to really realize we have a 90-day growing season. Most tomatoes, their whole growing season is over 90 days. So I found myself in the garden so much in the past few months. I'm always in the garden, but the garden is the studio for me right now, and sometimes that extends beyond the garden to the forest. The garden is in the forest, which is not so great for all the people it attracts, all of the creatures it attracts. But I think that all of my practices come together in the gardening, It's a sculpting practice. You know, when you're gardening, you're always growing new environments for gardens, for flowers, for natives, for annuals, for vegetables. It's a place of conviviality. It's a gathering place for birds, for people, for animals, for worms. Unfortunately, for snakes, I'm afraid of them. And it's a place of real potential. You know, so I think when I do leave academia, and I am on my slow way out, I'll be there for another 7 years. And 3E becomes my full-time life. It is the gardens that will most call me. But the studio is also a kind of garden in that way, you know, and the writing, as I was saying before, it grows through those movements, I'm sure. But yeah, the earth is the place that I'm most drawn to.
Well, I really, I feel very similar. I think we should probably do another episode on gardening and the power of gardening. There's definitely some interesting topics for us to pursue there, I think. I was going to ask you whether you consider yourself sort of a city mouse or a country mouse, but would it be fair to say that you're more of a forest dweller these days, it sounds like?
Well, I have to tell you that I was the most urban person you've ever met in your whole life.
Yeah.
I grew up on a farm and hated every second of it.
Yeah.
And I think now in retrospect, it had a lot to do with the rural and the way that the rural felt like an imprisonment to me, and the way that the urban allowed me to move. I didn't need people to drive me places.
Yeah.
What I've learned is that the forest is not rural. The forest has its own quality. And so I've definitely turned into a forest creature. And I can't explain that except to say that we change, don't we?
Yeah.
And I menopause really changed me in a way that's hard for me to explain. I love the city. I'm in Montreal right now. I love being here, but that earth, it calls me in a way that well, I could say one last thing. We talked about neurodiversity. One of the things that is so important about neurodiversity is activation.
Yeah.
And neurodiverse folks struggle with activation. And which is not to say that they're not full of movement. It's that they're full of so much movement that sometimes it's hard to orient the movement along a line. And so it can be hard to do work that the world takes for granted is easy to do. And that we often call executive work, executive function, things that are one step after another. And so a lot of the work I do with neurodiversity is coming up with creative modes of activation, and just being really curious about how, for example, there is no deficit of attention, what we call ADHD. There's a proliferation of attention. And how can we become more curious about the proliferation and also develop techniques for singling out modalities from that proliferation? So what the forest does for me right now is it really creates multiple points of activation. And so there is a really profound difference. When I'm in the city and I begin my day, I have to grow the day. So I have to really think, and I do it, you know, very, very actively every day, also because I struggle with depression, but to say, okay, well, Erin, what is growing the day today? Well, the first thing is obviously the coffee and the breakfast. And then, you know, why don't you go, I mean, I'll go to a cafe and I'll write or read or whatever, but I'm really growing an environment for myself and for the world to move through. I don't have to do that up north. The day that the constraints are so intense there, that the world is calling me. I have to go out and shovel because the solar panels need shoveling. And then once I've shoveled the panels, now something else is calling me. And before I know it, I'm walking through the forest and something else is calling me. So the world is activating me in a way where my body is in a state of relief.
Yeah.
And I think that's been really good for me.
It's almost like it's simplicity and necessity, isn't it? You know, and I think that's very good for the mind. And for the body too. Oh, thank you very much for sharing that. It's a really nice way of rounding things off. But I do have one last question for you. And I was recently at a conference and someone came up to me unannounced and just threw this at me. And it gave me pause. And then I've been asking everyone I've been interviewing recently. So I'm gonna leave you with this question. So time travel, if you could travel through time, would you go backwards or would you go forwards? And what would you hope to experience?
I think I would go backwards.
Okay.
I want to see those really big trees that
Oh,
we've gotten rid of, the white pines, that are gone almost completely.
the white
I,
pine, I don't think I know them.
yeah,
I
I want to
just,
see the ones that are, meters wide. I do
yeah,
want to see them.
I just, obviously we're both nerding out about our love of forests and nature in general, but I'm always happy to do that. And I also have had that change in me in recent years. And you know what, I think growing up in a rural community in rural England myself, I experienced some of the same things. And I quickly wanted to escape and went to Bristol, a bustling, at the time fairly radical city. And then, years after living there, I ended up in New York, the mecca of the metropolis, and then now living in the suburbs, but, very much in nature. National Park is 10 minutes away and I can walk and I'll be in the middle of the desert, and spending a lot of time in forests when I can too. It's really interesting to hear you reframe that about the rural. I think that's definitely kind of struck a chord with me. But again, I'm digressing and nerding out on things that we're talking about. Okay, so white pine, I'm going to have to look that up too.
Maybe you need to go back in time with me and encounter those trees.
Well, that's what I'm thinking, yes. So, well, look, as a final thought on that bombshell, let's call it a day there, but hopefully we'll find our way into the same TARDIS time machine or time, whatever it might be, and we can go back and check out some of these amazing trees at some point. But
I would love that.
You've certainly grown a lot of thoughts in my mind today, and I think our listeners too. So, Erin Manning, thank you so much for joining us on In Conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. You've really made me think about a few things, and just really enjoyed your book, and I hope everyone goes out there and checks out Being in Relation, which of course is available through internetbooks.com and all the usual types of bookshops and things. I know there's an Italian version coming and there's going to be different translations, so I urge people to keep an eye, and also just take a look at Erin. Just Google Erin Manning and see what comes up. Lots of weird and wonderful, fantastic books and ideas. So again, Erin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. I look forward to the next conversation.
Most definitely. Well, thank you again. And thanks to everyone who's listened today. We'll see you here next time on In Conversation. Thanks. And
all right. Bye, James.